Thanks so much for joining us today, Amy, and I am so excited to learn a little bit more about how someone goes from a non-tech background in anthropology all the way through to the cutting, bleeding edge of cybernetics and the future of what the world is going to look like. How do you make a journey between those two rather disparate subjects?
If cybernetics is the study of systems and the relationships between people and technology and the environment, that's somewhere I've always sat. So I grew up on a farm and in the countryside. People and technology and the environment are always interrelated. I went on into medical science, and in medical research, people, technology and environment always interrelated. In anthropology and thinking about people and food systems and nutrition, people, technology, environment are interrelated. And now I'm sitting in an engineering school and the same kinds of conversations are playing out with different sets of experts around me.
So for somebody who's not familiar, what is anthropology as a course of study?
Sure, I suppose anthropology is the study of people and society and cultures. One way to think about culture is the webs of meaning in which we're all entangled, I suppose. So it's about the connections between people, the values we have, the meaning we give to life. We know the science of nutrition, yet we still have major problems with nutrition and malnutrition and obesity around the world. That's not a scientific question, and it's not a scientific set of answers either, I don't think.
So that led you into thinking about things in terms of the future of technology and humans. How did you make that leap from what would be seen to be a non-techie kind of arena, failing of the scientific method, working out how human beings tick? How do you end up now looking at how humans work in maybe a more integrated way with technology into the future?
Absolutely. Well, after working in anthropology for a while, I found myself saying policymakers ought to do this a lot more. And I realised it had been years since I'd worked in policymaking, so I came back to Australia, to Canberra, to work in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and really started to apply some of the skills that I had developed. And it was while I was working there that I was asked to participate in a workshop at the ANU to run a workshop for the launch of this new branch of engineering that was being developed. So I ran the launch workshop and came across a group of people really doing interesting things at the bleeding edge of the kind of the future of research, which is exactly where I wanted to be. And importantly, the more I learned about the tech world, the more I realised just how important it is that more of us are in the conversation. So here I am.
So somebody dragged you into that conversation. It wasn't something that you saw and thought, oh, cybernetics, I really want to get involved with that. It was more like, oh, okay, I'll do you a favour. I'll come along and help you launch this 3A Institute.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I suppose, the approach to me initially was, look, there are these people at the ANU doing interesting work and I think you'd really get along. And I think for me, it was less about being dragged and more about hearing the kinds of questions they were asking and realising that I had a lot of the same questions and that I was interested in working in a place that wasn't just about investigating or researching those questions, but about developing interventions and solutions to create the future we all want to live in. And for me, that's one reason I love working in this space, is it's not just about doing research, it's about putting it into action, whether it's through education or other forms of intervention.
When we talk about diversity in STEM, of course, which is patchy across the different disciplines, how is gender diversity in the world of cybernetics?
Well, it depends which part of cybernetics, I guess, we're talking about. At the inception of cybernetics, there was maybe more gender diversity and diversity in fields than we might imagine. There were certainly women in the conversation. An anthropologist called Margaret Mead was one of those. There were certainly also a lot of men in the conversation. And something that I'm discovering more and more is reading through the books of cyberneticists and scientists of the past is the amount of times that you will see dedications to their wives or attributions or acknowledgements that their wives had equal intellectual contribution but were never named on the front of the book. So I think for me, the question of how much influence is there from women in cybernetics? Well, there's some in terms of the published knowledge we have. There's even more in the thinking that we've never acknowledged in published form, which is just as important.
So, cyberneticist, fantastic word. When I was at school, there was nowhere on my career, what do you want to be when you grow up sheet of, I would like to be a cyberneticist. Can you break that down for us? What is cybernetics? What does this actually mean as a concept in a word?
Well, and it's crazy, right? Because cybernetics is the place we get cyber from. And everybody's heard of the word cyber today, cybersecurity, cyber resilience, cyberspace. Cybernetics is where the cyber part comes from. And it's originally a kind of way of thinking about the world as a series of systems and systems that encompass people, the environment, and technology. So rather than just thinking about one of those things, understanding how they all come together, how they relate to each other and how they shape each other, it's a field that came into being out of the aftermath of the Second World War. So you can imagine that there is a series of researchers and practitioners that at the end of the Second World War have found that some of the research and science they've developed has been used for great harm. at scale, and that it's been used in the ways that don't necessarily expect. And out of that, they have a series of conversations saying, well, how do we ensure that our future doesn't look like our past? And it's out of that moment they start to have these conversations around thinking about technology, the environment, and people all joined up together. Now, we continue to have those systems around us today, but over time we've thought less and less maybe about them as together in one system and more as different parts.
So if I was to have to pressure you to put this in a nutshell, what is your elevator pitch around what it is that you actually do?
So here at the School of Cybernetics, we're building a new branch of engineering to take systems comprising technology, people, and the environment safely, sustainably, and responsibly to scale so that we create a future we all want to live in.
So this is a big question, and you don't have to answer, we'd have to fix it all today. But what are the key things that you think we need to do, both as universities, as government, and as industry, to encourage more women into tech?
We as educators have a role to play here because we can create an environment where everybody feels welcome and feels that they can access and learn what we are teaching, or we can create an environment that closes people out. Whether it's using language, whether it's using certain images, whether it's using certain turns of phrase, all of those things matter for keeping people in the classroom and learning and inspired and interested in participating in the future of this space.
Does education have limitations for cybernetics, right? So you're sitting here at one of the best universities in the world, creating the brand new School of Engineering. We're the only school of cybernetics in the Southern Hemisphere. You're at a place where what you create here is going to influence conversations potentially for generations, no pressure.
Yep.
So in terms of developing some of those educational materials, what are you having to think about in terms of the biases across cybernetics in order to make sure you create egalitarian opportunities inside education?
I think one of the things that building a new cybernetics brings with it is the opportunity and probably responsibility to reimagine what education looks like, who it's available to, whose voices are involved in designing it or delivering it. Even going back to basics and thinking about what do we learn? Where do we learn? Who do we learn from? And how do we start having conversations more in those learning spaces? There are all sorts of incredible examples that look really different to what we understand as an education system in Australia. There are examples of Indigenous cultural approaches to learning and to development, to passing down and custodianship of knowledge. There are different approaches in different cultural settings. There are different approaches in different areas of practice. So, for example, the ideas of play that you would use to learn if you're working with children, or the ideas of elite sports performance that you see in sports coaching. All of these are really different ways of teaching and learning and developing, and all of these invite different people in different ways to learn in different ways. And I think we have an opportunity to build all of that and imagine what the future of education where cybernetics is concerned looks like.
It's both an exciting and I'd suggest potentially a little bit scary place, because what you do now is going to set the foundation stone going forwards. So when we look at things like the world of education and the world of STEM, the world of anthropology, there are different levels of diversity across those fields. Have you seen where diversity of the people that are creating a cybernetic system has directly led to its downfall? And are there ways in which we can prevent that from happening again?
Diversity and downfall? Absolutely, because working in mixed teams is hugely challenging. And I think for me, one of the biggest challenges is great collaboration is ultimately, for me at least, about giving something of yourself up. It might be giving up your time. It might be giving up a position that you had or an opinion that you had. It might be giving up some part of your history where you realize that may need to be rewritten. And giving something away requires vulnerability. It's often really painful. It often kind of creates in teams churn and discomfort. So absolutely, there are many, many examples. And I suspect if we're all sitting here watching today, everyone can think of an example where a team just hasn't worked. And one of the reasons is it's really hard.
So going forwards now, we get this right. You get the teaching right, the education right. What are we going to do to make sure that enough women apply to study cybernetics?
So I think what's really exciting for me is that the work we're doing here at the School of Cybernetics is already led by women. It's led by more women than maybe we've ever seen in the world of cybernetics. We have the director Distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell. We've got an Assistant Director, Alex Zafiroglu. We have a number of other women on the staff doing important and interesting work. We are also surfacing the women that were involved in the cybernetics conversations that were missing from those conversations in published format. And I think for me, what that means is we're already doing a lot. So what are we going to do in future? Probably more of that. And I think we need to think beyond just bringing women in and towards really meaningfully bringing in lots of other voices as well.
When you talk about churn in groups, we think about how board directors might work, for example, and we know that fewer than 3% of Australian company directors have STEM skills. Yet cybernetics and STEM skills and innovation are going to be absolutely fundamental to our economic recovery. How do we bridge that gap?
Well, absolutely. And I think this is a great question that we're asking a lot with our educational programs as well, is not only how do we educate the next generation, but how do we educate the previous generation and bring knowledge or understanding or new ways of thinking up to speed? Or how do we embed different ways of thinking that people might not have been accustomed to in the past? So if we are thinking about joining up technology, environment and people, how do we disrupt the conversations that are being had at the moment with just the technology part? And I think we are thinking really carefully about what education and what form do we take to board members, to people in leadership positions, to people who are happily and successfully working in their current careers. And I think one of the reasons that's going to be really challenging is learning is also often uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It can be really hard when you are mid-career and mid-flight and hugely successful to find yourself in a position of discomfort again.
So there'll be some young women watching this right now that will just be like, this is not a pathway that's ever been shown to me before. I have no concept of how to get from where I am right now to the things that you're talking about. What's maybe one or two pieces of advice that you would give them to get them started on this path towards having cybernetics as part of their future?
I'm going to give you 3.
Okay.
Is that okay?
That's bonus.
So the first one I'd suggest is have a look at some of the material we've already produced here at the School of Cybernetics and get familiar with it, see if you're still interested. The second thing I would suggest is, especially if you're mid-study, if you've got room for it, go and find something to study that's the polar opposite of the rest of your trajectory. So if you are in a history degree, go and take a computer science topic. If you're in computer science, go and take a gender studies topic, just to start opening your way of thinking to systems and to connections and to other perspectives that sit around you. And the third thing that I'd suggest, which is advice I think I'd also give my younger self, should I have my time again, is to get in touch and ask. Ask us. We love people getting in touch and asking us how they can get involved. And I think for me, I had a real moment at one point when I was speaking to my little brother, actually, and talking about how there was something I was really interested in, but I couldn't possibly get in touch and ask because I didn't want to bother them. And he sat me down and looked at me and said, look, we have a problem with women advancing into these kind of fields in this country. And I said, yeah. And he said, and the way you're talking, it sounds like you want to be part of the problem. He said, do you want to be part of the problem? And I said, no, I don't want to be part of the problem. But it's really stuck with me because I think there are small things I can do, and it's not to blame me and say that I shouldn't be thinking that way. But every time I hesitate now, I have his voice in my head thinking, no, I don't want to be part of the problem here. I want to be part of the solution. And so I do write and ask. And so I would encourage people to get in touch and ask us.